I was sitting at my art desk, drawing a princess for my latest children's book, when I looked out the window and saw the real queen of our neighborhood doing exactly what I'd suspected all week. Nancy Carter, our HOA president with her mini megaphone and clipboard, was casually taking a package from my porch and shoving it in her bag like it was her God-given right. Third time this week. I knew I had to do something, but what I didn't know was that other eyes were watching her too. Eyes belonging to someone with a government badge. If you're watching on your phone, comment with a phone emoji. On computer, comment with a computer emoji, because this story will make you want to throw your device at least 3 times. 6 months ago, I thought I'd found paradise when I moved to Maple Grove. The neighborhood looked like something straight out of a suburban dream, complete white picket fences, manicured lawns, and those charming front porches where I imagined neighbors would wave and chat about weekend barbecues. I'm Leon Brooks, and I make my living illustrating children's books, which means I work from home and value peace and quiet above almost everything else. My little studio setup was perfect, facing the front yard where I could watch delivery trucks and get inspired by the changing seasons. I thought I'd escaped the chaos of apartment living and nosy neighbors forever. That illusion shattered exactly 3 weeks after I'd settled in, when I received what I can only describe as a royal summons. The notice was printed on official HOA letterhead and used phrases like mandatory attendance and community compliance orientation. The tone was so formal and commanding, you'd think I was being called to appear before a federal judge rather than attend a neighborhood meeting. The letter informed me that as a new resident, I was required to attend an orientation session to learn about our community standards and expectations. It was scheduled for 7 p.m. sharp at the community center, and the phrase, "no exceptions will be made for scheduling conflicts," was underlined twice in red ink. Walking into that community center felt like entering a courtroom where I was the defendant and everyone else was the jury. About 15 residents sat in folding chairs arranged in neat rows, and most of them looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. At the front of the room stood Nancy Carter, and I knew immediately that this woman saw herself as the undisputed ruler of our little suburban kingdom. She was probably in her late 30s, with bleached blonde hair cut in a severe bob that looked like she'd done it herself with kitchen scissors. Her outfit was an interesting choice, a faded purple hoodie that had seen better days, but it was covered in at least 6 different HOA pins and badges, like she was a decorated military officer. The centerpiece of her ensemble was a small handheld megaphone that hung from a lanyard around her neck, even though the room was small enough that she could have whispered and everyone would hear her perfectly. Nancy began the meeting by tapping her megaphone 3 times to get our attention, then launched into what she called the Maple Grove Community Standards Manual. She opened a folder that was easily 3 inches thick and began reading rules with the enthusiasm of someone announcing lottery numbers. Rule number 1, mailbox numbering must not exceed 2 1/2 inches in height and must be clearly visible from the street. Rule number 2, all delivered packages must be retrieved from porches and secured indoors within 2 hours of delivery to maintain aesthetic standards. Rule number 3, personal surveillance equipment including cameras, recording devices, or monitoring systems directed toward common areas or neighboring properties violates our community trust policy and is strictly prohibited. She continued this for 47 rules. Yes, I counted, and each one seemed more absurd than the last. When Nancy finally paused for questions, I politely raised my hand and asked about the logic behind some of the more unusual rules, particularly the one about surveillance equipment, since I'd been considering a doorbell camera for security. The change in Nancy's demeanor was immediate and unsettling. Her friendly neighborhood welcome mask slipped, and I could see something much colder underneath. "We have very specific standards here, Mr. Brooks," she said, emphasizing my name like it left a bad taste in her mouth. "Standards that some people find challenging to meet, but I'm sure a creative person like yourself will figure it out." The way she said creative person made it sound like a communicable disease. The other residents suddenly found their shoes fascinating, and I realized I'd somehow made myself a target by asking perfectly reasonable questions. After the meeting ended, I walked home, feeling unsettled but hoping I was just overthinking things. Maybe Nancy was having a bad day, or maybe HOA leadership just attracted controlling personalities. I settled into my evening routine, made some tea, and started sketching ideas for my next project. Around 9:30, I glanced out my front window to check if I'd left anything on the porch, And that's when I saw her. Nancy Carter was standing at the end of my driveway with that thick folder in her hands, writing notes while staring directly at my house. She wasn't trying to be discreet about it either. When she noticed me looking, she didn't wave or smile or show any embarrassment at being caught. Instead, she just continued writing, looked up at my house one more time, and then walked away with the slow, deliberate pace of someone who wanted to make sure I understood that I was being watched. The first shot in what I now think of as the Maple Grove package wars arrived in my email inbox at exactly 8:15 the next morning. The subject line read, "Violation notice, immediate compliance required," and for a moment I thought it might be spam. Unfortunately, it was very real and very much from Nancy Carter. Dear Mr. Brooks, it began with the kind of formality usually reserved for legal documents. During my routine community inspection yesterday evening, I observed that your mailbox numbering exceeds our clearly stated 2 1/2 inch standard by approximately 3 millimeters. This violation of our aesthetic guidelines requires immediate correction to maintain the visual harmony of our neighborhood. Please remedy this issue within 72 hours or face potential fines as outlined in Section 12 of your HOA agreement. I stared at the email for a full minute, convinced I was misreading something. 3 millimeters. This woman was complaining about 3 millimeters on mailbox numbers. I grabbed a ruler from my art supplies and marched outside to measure my house numbers, half expecting to find that Nancy was right and I'd somehow overlooked an obvious violation. The numbers measured exactly 2 1/2 inches, not 3 millimeters over, not 1 millimeter over, exactly what the rules specify. I took several photos from different angles, making sure to include the ruler in each shot for absolute proof, then composed what I thought was a polite and factual response. Dear Nancy, thank you for bringing this to my attention. However, after careful measurement with a standard ruler, I found that my mailbox numbers are exactly 2 1/2 inches as required. I've attached photographic evidence for your review. Please let me know if you need any additional documentation. Nancy's response came back within an hour, and any pretense of neighborly concern had completely evaporated. Mr. Brooks, your argumentative tone and defensive attitude clearly violate our community harmony guidelines. The fact that you feel the need to challenge my authority with photographs suggests a troubling pattern of non-compliance that extends beyond simple measurement issues. I will be monitoring your property more closely to ensure that other violations are not occurring. The email was CC'd to the entire HOA board, turning what should have been a simple misunderstanding into a public spectacle. I was beginning to understand that this wasn't really about mailbox fonts or community standards. This was about power, and Nancy Carter was determined to establish exactly who held it in Maple Grove. The trash can incident happened 2 days later, and it was so petty that I almost couldn't believe it was real. Tuesday was garbage day in our neighborhood, and like every other resident, I'd placed my can at the curb the night before. I'd been extra careful about placement, making sure it was exactly where the other cans were positioned, not blocking any sidewalks or driveways. Around 7 in the morning, I heard a commotion outside and looked out to see Nancy standing next to my overturned trash can, with garbage scattered across the street. She was wearing her signature hoodie and had her clipboard out, documenting what she was clearly positioning as another violation. When she saw me watching from the window, she actually waved and pointed at the mess like she was doing me a favor by bringing it to my attention. I threw on a jacket and rushed outside to clean up the scattered garbage before it blew into other yards or clogged storm drains. As I knelt on the pavement stuffing banana peels and coffee grounds back into the can, Nancy approached with her megaphone ready. "I'm afraid your trash receptacle was improperly positioned, Mr. Brooks. It was blocking pedestrian access and created a safety hazard. I took the liberty of moving it to a more appropriate location, but unfortunately, it appears the lid wasn't properly secured." Her tone was so sickeningly sweet that I felt my teeth ache. Every word was carefully chosen to make her sound helpful while making me look irresponsible. The worst part was that several neighbors had come out to see what the noise was about, and they were all watching me crawl around picking up garbage, like some kind of community service punishment. What Nancy didn't realize was that I'd taken photos of my properly placed trash can the night before, just in case she tried something like this. I had also photographed the other cans on the street for comparison, and it was obvious that mine had been positioned exactly like everyone else's. After I finished cleaning up the mess, I sent these photos to the HOA board along with a detailed complaint about Nancy's behavior. For the first time since moving to Maple Grove, I felt like I was fighting back instead of just taking whatever punishment she decided to dish out. The board's response was swift and surprisingly supportive. They sent Nancy a formal reprimand and required her to send a public apology email to all residents about the importance of accurate documentation before taking corrective action. Nancy's apology email was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive compliance. I apologize for any misunderstanding regarding the trash receptacle incident involving Mr. Brooks. While my intentions were focused on maintaining community safety standards, I acknowledge that my documentation may have been incomplete. In the future, I will ensure that all evidence is thoroughly collected before taking any necessary corrective actions. She managed to apologize without actually admitting wrongdoing, and the phrase necessary corrective actions made it clear that she considered herself the neighborhood's law enforcement officer. Rather than backing down after being reprimanded, Nancy seemed to view this as escalation, and I had the sinking feeling that things were about to get much worse. That night, around 2 a.m, I was awakened by footsteps on my front porch. Living alone had made me a light sleeper, and I'd learned to distinguish between normal neighborhood sounds and things that didn't belong. These footsteps were deliberate and cautious, the kind someone makes when they're trying not to be heard. I crept to my bedroom window and carefully peered through the blinds toward my front door. A shadowy figure with a flashlight was examining my mailbox area, spending way too much time looking at something that should have taken 30 seconds to check. The person was too far away and moving too carefully for me to make out specific details, but the general build and height looked familiar. When a car drove by and the headlights briefly illuminated my porch, the figure quickly disappeared around the side of my house, leaving me wide awake and wondering if Nancy Carter's obsession with community standards had crossed the line into genuine harassment. The first package disappeared on a Thursday afternoon in early March, and I spent 3 days convinced it was just a shipping mistake. I'd ordered a set of professional watercolor paints and specialized brushes for a client project, worth about $200, and scheduled for delivery between noon and 4 p.m. The tracking information showed delivered to front door at 2:47 p.m., complete with a photo of the package sitting on my porch next to my welcome mat. But when I checked my porch at 5 o'clock, there was nothing there, except the mat and a few dead leaves that had blown over from my neighbor's yard. I called the shipping company first, then the art supply store, and everyone assured me that packages don't just vanish, and that it would probably turn up within a day or two. The second package disappeared exactly 1 week later, and that's when my artist's eye for patterns started kicking in. This time it was a birthday gift for my 8-year-old nephew. A set of building blocks that I'd ordered with enough time for delivery and gift wrapping. Again, the tracking showed successful delivery at 2:15 p.m., complete with a photo, and again the package was nowhere to be found when I got home from grocery shopping around 4:30. I filed a police report this time, but the officer who took my statement seemed bored and suggested that maybe I should consider getting a delivery box or having packages sent to my workplace. Package theft is pretty common these days, he said, while barely looking up from his paperwork. Usually just kids looking for easy targets. It'll probably stop once they realize you don't get anything interesting. That's when I decided to start paying attention to the timing and patterns around my missing packages. I created a simple chart in one of my sketchbooks, tracking delivery confirmation times against my own schedule and the general rhythm of neighborhood activity. What I discovered was interesting. Both packages had been delivered during the peak afternoon hours when most people were still at work. But when Nancy Carter made her daily community patrol walks around the neighborhood, I'd noticed her routine because she always carried that oversized tote bag and her clipboard, stopping to examine mailboxes, measure lawn heights, and take notes about potential violations. The timing was too convenient to be coincidental. I started watching Nancy's walks more carefully, positioning myself at my front window during the afternoon hours when packages were typically delivered. What I observed was fascinating from a behavioral standpoint. Nancy's route took her past every house in our section of Maple Grove, but she spent significantly more time examining properties where delivery trucks had recently stopped. She carried a large canvas tote bag that appeared empty at the beginning of her walks, but looked noticeably heavier by the time she returned home. Most telling was her body language around mailboxes and porches where packages had been delivered. Instead of her usual quick documentation routine, she would linger, looking around to see if anyone was watching, before moving closer to examine whatever had been left. The confrontation I'd been building up courage for finally happened on a Tuesday afternoon when I saw Nancy approaching my neighbor's house just minutes after a delivery truck had left a package on their porch. I grabbed my jacket and walked outside casually, timing my appearance to coincide with Nancy's arrival at my own mailbox. "Good afternoon, Nancy," I said in my friendliest voice. I've noticed you walking by quite often when packages get delivered. That's really dedicated community service." Her reaction was immediate and telling. She clutched her tote bag closer to her body and took a step back, like I'd caught her doing something she shouldn't be doing. "That's my responsibility as HOA president," she replied, but her voice had that defensive edge I was starting to recognize. Some residents aren't properly securing their deliveries, and it creates liability issues for the community. Nancy's response was such a perfect non-denial that I knew I was onto something. She hadn't denied being around during deliveries, she justified it. She hadn't denied taking anything, she'd blamed residents for not securing their property. Most importantly, she'd basically admitted that she considered unsecured packages to be a problem that required her intervention. "I've had a couple packages go missing recently," I said, watching her face carefully for any reaction. "The shipping company says they delivered them, but they weren't there when I got home. Have you noticed anyone suspicious around the neighborhood?" Nancy's expression shifted into what I can only describe as calculated concern, the look of someone who's prepared for this exact conversation. "Oh, that's terrible," Nancy said, and her tone was so perfectly sympathetic that it felt rehearsed. "You know, this neighborhood has had some issues with package security lately. Maybe you should consider getting a delivery locker or having things sent to your workplace. It's really not safe to leave valuable items sitting on porches for hours at a time." The way she said valuable items made my skin crawl, like she had intimate knowledge of what was in packages that wasn't her business to know. She was essentially giving me advice on how to prevent the very crime I suspected her of committing, and doing it with the concerned tone of a helpful neighbor. It was psychological manipulation at its finest, making me question whether I was being paranoid while simultaneously confessing her guilt in the most indirect way possible. After Nancy walked away, I stood on my porch for a long time thinking about the conversation and what it revealed. She hadn't asked what was in the missing packages, which would have been a natural question from an innocent person. She hadn't offered to help me look for them or file reports, which would have been the response of someone genuinely concerned about community safety. Instead, she'd immediately focused on prevention strategies that would eliminate her opportunity to steal packages, which suggested she knew exactly why packages were disappearing and how to make it stop. I realized that Nancy Carter wasn't just a controlling HOA president with boundary issues. She was a thief who was using her position of authority to cover her crimes and gaslight her victims. Unknown to me at the time, a man named Daniel Crane had been sitting in a dark sedan parked across the street, photographing Nancy's interactions with packages and residents throughout the neighborhood. Inspector Crane worked for the United States Postal Service's Law Enforcement Division, and he'd been investigating reports of systematic mail theft in Maple Grove for the past 3 months. Nancy Carter's name had appeared in enough victim statements to warrant surveillance, and my missing packages were just 2 items in a growing file of evidence. While I was playing amateur detective from my front window, a federal investigation was building a case that would eventually bring down Nancy's entire operation. But I wouldn't learn about Inspector Crane's involvement for several more weeks, during which Nancy's behavior would escalate from petty theft to something much more serious. Installing a security camera felt like crossing a line I hadn't wanted to cross, but Nancy Carter had made it clear that polite conversation and HOA complaints weren't going to solve my package theft problem. I spent a weekend researching options and decided on a simple doorbell camera that would give me a clear view of my front porch without being too obvious or expensive. The installation was straightforward enough that I could do it myself, and within a few hours, I had high-definition video coverage of my entire front entrance area. I felt a mix of empowerment and sadness. Empowerment because I was finally taking control of the situation, and sadness because I had to treat my own neighborhood like a crime scene. The camera's first real test came exactly 5 days later when I ordered a replacement set of watercolor paints to finish the project that had been delayed by my previous missing package. I made sure to be away from the house during typical delivery hours, wanting to create the exact conditions under which my packages had previously disappeared. The delivery truck arrived at 2:23 p.m., according to the timestamp, and the driver placed the package in the exact spot where I'd instructed, clearly visible but not immediately obvious from the street. I stayed away until 4:15, giving plenty of time for any potential theft to occur, before returning home to check both my porch and my camera footage. The package was gone, of course, but this time I had evidence. The camera had captured everything in crystal clear high definition, and what I saw was far more deliberate and calculated than I'd expected. At 2:51 p.m., Nancy Carter approached my porch with her usual tote bag and clipboard, But her behavior was completely different from her normal community patrol routine. Instead of her typical quick documentation and movement to the next house, she spent almost 3 minutes examining my package. She picked it up, turned it over to read the shipping label, and appeared to be assessing its size and potential value. This wasn't opportunistic theft by someone who happened to be walking by. This was a calculated evaluation by someone who knew exactly what she was doing. What made the video even more damning was Nancy's body language and awareness of her surroundings. Before approaching my porch, she looked up and down the street to make sure no one was watching. She positioned herself to block the view of the package from the street while she examined it. When she finally decided to take it, she didn't just grab it and run like a nervous amateur. She calmly placed it in her tote bag, adjusted her clipboard to make everything look normal, and walked away with the same measured pace she always used during her community patrols. This was someone who had done this many times before and had developed a system to avoid detection. Armed with undeniable video evidence, I decided it was time for a direct confrontation. I called Nancy and asked if she could come over to discuss a community safety issue, and she agreed with the kind of enthusiasm that suggested she was expecting to catch me in some kind of violation. When she arrived at my front door 15 minutes later, she was carrying her clipboard and wearing an expression of official concern that I now recognized as completely fake. "What can I help you with, Mr. Brooks?" she asked, and I could tell she was already formulating whatever lecture she planned to deliver about proper package security or community responsibility. Instead of answering her question, I pulled out my phone and played the security camera footage. Nancy's reaction was immediate and revealing. Her face went completely white, then red, then settled into a kind of desperate anger that I'd never seen before. "You think you're so smart," she hissed, and all pretense of neighborly concern evaporated. "I've been protecting this neighborhood for 6 years from people like you. People who don't understand what it takes to maintain standards and keep property values up." Her voice was getting louder and more frantic with each word, and I realized that I was seeing the real Nancy Carter for the first time. Not the carefully constructed HOA president persona she usually presented. "People like me?" I asked, genuinely confused about what she meant. Nancy's response revealed exactly how deep her delusions ran. People who think they can move into an established community and change everything to suit themselves. People who question authority and create problems where none existed before. "You've been nothing but trouble since the day you moved here, and I've been watching you, documenting everything, building a case against you." The irony was staggering. Here was a woman who had been systematically stealing packages from her neighbors, and she was convincing herself that I was the criminal for catching her in the act. "This is illegal surveillance," she continued, waving at my phone. "I'm calling the police right now to report you for violating privacy laws." Nancy actually did call the police, but the conversation didn't go the way she expected. When Deputy Spencer arrived 20 minutes later, he listened to Nancy's complaint about illegal surveillance, then asked to see the footage that had prompted the complaint. After watching the video twice, he turned to Nancy with an expression that was professionally neutral, but clearly suspicious. "Ma'am, this footage shows you taking a package from Mr. Brooks' porch. That's theft of mail, which is a federal crime. I need to ask you some questions about this incident." Nancy's response was pure panic disguised as indignation. "That's not what happened at all. I was protecting the package from theft. This neighborhood has had problems with package security, and I was securing it for safekeeping." Deputy Spencer wasn't buying Nancy's story, and I could see him mentally cataloging her behavior and responses for his report. "Ma'am, if you were securing the package for safekeeping, why didn't you leave a note or contact Mr. Brooks to let him know where it was? And where is the package now?" Nancy's answer revealed just how desperate she was becoming. "I don't have to answer these questions. I'm the HOA president here, and I have every right to maintain community security standards." She was essentially claiming that her position gave her the authority to take other people's property, which even I knew was completely illegal. Deputy Spencer handed me his business card and said something that sent chills down my spine. "Sir, a federal mail inspector wants to speak with you about this incident. Today. Apparently, you're not the first person in this neighborhood to report missing packages." Inspector Daniel Crane looked exactly like what I would have expected from a federal law enforcement officer. Professional, calm, and completely unimpressed by suburban drama. He was probably in his mid-40s, with the kind of quiet confidence that comes from years of dealing with people who think they're smarter than the law. When he showed up at my door 3 hours after Deputy Spencer left, he was carrying a thick folder and wearing an expression that suggested he knew far more about my situation than I did. "Mr. Brooks, I'm Inspector Crane with the United States Postal Service, Office of Inspector General. I understand you've been having problems with missing packages, and I'd like to discuss some information that might interest you. What Inspector Crane told me over the next hour completely changed my understanding of what had been happening in Maple Grove. Nancy Carter wasn't just stealing my packages. She was running a sophisticated theft operation that had been targeting residents across 3 different neighborhoods for the past 8 months. We've received reports from 67 different victims, Inspector Crane explained, with total losses estimated at over $18,000. Your security camera footage is the first direct evidence we've obtained showing Mrs. Carter in the act of theft, and it's exactly what we need to move forward with federal charges. The scope of Nancy's operation was staggering, and I realized that my missing art supplies were just a tiny piece of a much larger criminal enterprise. Inspector Crane opened his folder and showed me printed screenshots from something called Maple Grove Finds, an online selling account that had been listing and selling items matching the descriptions of stolen packages. Mrs. Carter has been running a systematic operation, he explained. She uses her position as HOA president to identify target houses, monitors delivery patterns, steals packages during optimal times, and then resells the contents online. This isn't petty theft, Miss Brooks. This is organized retail crime, and it carries serious federal penalties. He showed me photos of my missing watercolor paints listed for sale online, along with dozens of other items that I recognized from delivery trucks I'd seen throughout the neighborhood. The plan that Inspector Crane proposed was both simple and brilliant. We need to catch Mrs. Carter in the act one more time, with federal agents positioned to make an immediate arrest. We'll arrange for a high-value package to be delivered to your address, containing a GPS tracking device that will allow us to follow it to wherever she takes stolen goods. Once she touches that package, we'll have all the evidence we need for multiple federal charges. The idea of being bait in a federal sting operation was both terrifying and exciting, and I agreed immediately. After months of feeling helpless and victimized, I was finally going to help bring Nancy Carter to justice. What I didn't expect was Nancy's escalating desperation, as she sensed that something was changing in the neighborhood dynamic. The day after my conversation with Inspector Crane, Nancy called an emergency HOA meeting to address what she called a serious threat to community security and privacy. The meeting notice sent to all residents claimed that certain individuals have been conducting illegal surveillance activities that violate our community trust and potentially expose all residents to criminal liability. She was clearly trying to turn the neighborhood against me before I could expose her crimes, and the strategy was clever enough that I worried it might actually work. Nancy's emergency meeting was a masterpiece of manipulation and misdirection. She stood at the front of the community center with a new folder labeled Privacy Violations and Community Safety and launched into a presentation about the dangers of residential surveillance systems. Unauthorized recording devices create legal liability for our entire community, she announced to the 15 residents who had bothered to attend. When one resident violates the privacy rights of others, it exposes all of us to potential lawsuits and criminal charges. We have policies against surveillance for very good reasons, and those policies must be enforced to protect everyone. She was essentially arguing that catching criminals was worse than being victimized by them, and doing it with such authority that several residents were nodding along. The most disturbing part of Nancy's presentation was how she positioned herself as the victim of my harassment and intimidation tactics. She claimed that I had been stalking her during her community service activities, filming her without consent, and using the footage to make false accusations about her character and integrity. Mr. Brooks has created a hostile environment that makes it difficult for me to perform my duties as your elected representative, she said with a straight face. His behavior represents exactly the kind of divisive influence that threatens the harmony and safety of our community. She was literally describing her own actions while claiming to be the victim of them, and doing it so convincingly that I could see some residents looking at me with suspicion and disapproval. Inspector Crane had warned me that desperate criminals often escalate their behavior when they feel cornered, but I wasn't prepared for Nancy's next move. The morning after her emergency meeting, I found a small, handwritten sign posted on my front door that read, "Smile, you're being watched and federally tracked." It wasn't signed, but the handwriting and passive-aggressive tone were unmistakably Nancy. The message was clearly meant to intimidate me and make me paranoid about my own surveillance system, but it had the opposite effect. I realized that Nancy was scared enough to risk additional criminal charges by threatening a federal witness, which meant that Inspector Crane's plan was already working. Nancy Carter's reign of terror in Maple Grove was about to end, and her next move would be her most dangerous and her last. The morning of the federal sting operation felt like the calm before a storm that I'd been preparing for without knowing it. Inspector Crane had positioned his surveillance team in unmarked vehicles throughout the neighborhood. An especially prepared package containing electronic monitoring equipment was scheduled for delivery to my address between 2 and 4 p.m. The package was designed to look like expensive electronics, the kind of high-value item that Nancy had shown a particular preference for stealing, and it would allow federal agents to track its location in real time once she took it. I was supposed to act completely normal, go about my regular routine, and let the professionals handle everything once Nancy made her move. Acting normal turned out to be much harder than I'd expected. Every sound from outside made me jump, and I found myself constantly checking the time and looking out windows for signs of delivery trucks or Nancy's approach. Inspector Crane had instructed me to stay inside and avoid any contact with Nancy until after the arrest, but the waiting was making me incredibly anxious. Around noon, I decided to focus on my art to keep my hands busy and my mind occupied, but even that, I kept thinking about everything that had led to this moment. From that first suspicious HOA meeting to Nancy's escalating criminal behavior, and wondering if I was doing the right thing by helping to set her up for federal charges. The delivery truck arrived at exactly 2:37 p.m., and I watched from my front window as the driver placed the bait package in the same spot where my previous packages had been stolen. The box was slightly larger than usual and labeled with the kind of shipping company that typically handles expensive electronics, exactly the sort of thing that would catch Nancy's attention during her afternoon patrol. Inspector Crane had told me that federal agents were positioned at multiple locations around the neighborhood, ready to move as soon as Nancy touched the package, but I couldn't see any obvious signs of their presence. The whole operation was designed to look completely normal from Nancy's perspective. Just another delivery in a neighborhood where she'd been successfully stealing packages for months. But Nancy didn't show up at her usual time. 2:50 p.m. came and went with no sign of her characteristic tote bag and clipboard. 3:15 passed, then 3:30, then 4 o'clock, and still nothing. I started to worry that she had somehow figured out what was happening, or that her meeting the night before had spooked her enough to change her routine. Inspector Crane had warned me that criminals sometimes develop instincts about when they're being watched, and Nancy was clearly smarter and more experienced than I'd initially given her credit for. By 4:30, I was texting Inspector Crane to ask if the operation had failed, and his response was simply, "Patience. Desperation has its own timeline." As evening approached, I started to relax and assumed that nothing was going to happen that day. I made dinner, watched some television, and tried to convince myself that maybe Nancy had finally realized the risks she was taking and decided to stop stealing packages. Around 10 p.m., I went through my normal bedtime routine and settled in with a book, feeling oddly disappointed that the day had passed without incident. I'd been psychologically prepared for confrontation and resolution, and the anticlimax left me feeling unsettled and incomplete. Inspector Crane had said that federal agents would maintain surveillance through the night, but I assumed they were just being thorough and that nothing would actually happen after dark. I was wrong. At 11:32 p.m., I was jolted awake by the sound of my front door opening. For a moment, I thought I was dreaming or mishearing something, but then I heard footsteps in my living room and the unmistakable sound of someone moving around my furniture. My first instinct was to call 911, but then I heard a voice that I recognized, and the situation became much more complicated. Nancy Carter was in my house, and she was talking to herself in a frantic whisper that I could barely make out from my bedroom. Where is it? Where does she keep the evidence? Has to be here somewhere. Has to be proof of what she's really doing. I crept to my bedroom door and listened as Nancy ransacked my living room, clearly looking for something specific. Her voice was getting louder and more agitated as she failed to find whatever she was seeking. Drug money has to be drug money. Nobody orders this many art supplies unless they're laundering money. Where are the drugs? Where are the financial records? She was building an elaborate conspiracy theory to justify her presence in my house, convincing herself that I was the real criminal and that she was conducting some kind of citizen's investigation. The delusion was so complete and so divorced from reality that I realized Nancy Carter had lost touch with any objective understanding of her own behavior. When I finally worked up the courage to confront her, Nancy was standing in my living room with her flashlight pointed at my art supplies, photographing everything with her phone like she was documenting evidence of criminal activity. "What the hell are you doing in my house?" I shouted, flipping on the overhead lights and startling her so badly that she dropped her phone. Her response revealed just how far gone she really was. "Looking for evidence of your crimes. You think you're so clever, but I know what you're really doing here. Nobody needs this many art supplies unless they're running some kind of money laundering operation." She was holding one of my paintbrushes like it was a smoking gun, completely convinced that she'd uncovered proof of my supposed criminal enterprise. Nancy's break-in was her final and most desperate attempt to regain control of a situation that had spiraled completely beyond her ability to manage. She'd taken the bait package on her way into my house, and federal agents were already tracking its location to her garage, where they would soon discover the full scope of her theft operation. But Nancy didn't know any of that yet. As far as she was concerned, she was conducting a righteous investigation into my criminal activities, and my outrage at finding her in my house was just further proof of my guilt. She fled through my back door when I threatened to call the police, leaving behind evidence of breaking and entering to add to her growing list of federal charges. Inspector Crane called me within minutes to confirm that Nancy had taken the bait package and that federal agents would be executing search warrants at dawn. Nancy Carter's criminal empire in Maple Grove would end with the sunrise, and the entire neighborhood would finally see justice delivered. At exactly 6 a.m., Maple Grove experienced something that suburban neighborhoods rarely witness: a coordinated federal law enforcement operation, complete with multiple government vehicles, armed agents, and search warrants executed with military precision. I watched from my front window as unmarked cars surrounded Nancy Carter's house, followed by uniformed officers and federal agents who moved with the kind of calm efficiency that comes from years of conducting similar operations. The entire street came alive as neighbors emerged from their houses to see what was happening, many of them still in their pajamas and robes, holding coffee cups and cell phones as they tried to understand why their quiet neighborhood had suddenly become the center of a federal investigation. Nancy's arrest was everything I'd hoped it would be after months of harassment and theft. She was dragged from her house in a faded bathrobe, her usually perfect bob disheveled, and her face showing the kind of panic that comes from finally facing consequences for actions she'd convinced herself were justified. The handcuffs looked particularly appropriate on someone who had spent so much time trying to control and restrict other people's behavior, and watching federal agents perp-walk her past the neighbors she'd tormented felt like the most satisfying moment of my entire life. Children were asking their parents why the mean lady was being arrested, and several residents were openly filming the whole thing with their phones, ensuring that Nancy's public humiliation would be documented and remembered. The search of Nancy's garage revealed the true scope of her criminal operation, and even I was shocked by what federal agents discovered. The space had been converted into what Inspector Crane described as a professional theft and resale operation, with systematic shelving units organizing stolen packages by value and type, a dedicated photography station for creating online listings, and shipping supplies for mailing sold items to buyers across the country. The garage contained evidence of thefts dating back over a year, with detailed records showing that Nancy had been stealing packages from dozens of neighborhoods throughout 3 different zip codes, not just Maple Grove. Rick Dawson, my neighbor who had helped me clean up after Nancy's trash can sabotage, was one of the first residents to identify his stolen property among the evidence. "My golf clubs," he shouted when he saw agents carrying a familiar set of clubs from Nancy's garage. "She told me they'd probably been stolen by teenagers from another neighborhood." Other residents quickly began recognizing items they'd reported missing over the past several months, from Christmas presents that never arrived to important documents that had disappeared from mailboxes. The total value of recovered merchandise exceeded $25,000, representing dozens of families who had been victimized by Nancy's systematic theft operation. Inspector Crane explained to the gathered crowd that Nancy Carter's crimes went far beyond simple package theft. Mrs. Carter was operating a sophisticated retail fraud scheme, he announced to the neighbors who had gathered to watch the search. Target houses. She used her position as HOA president to identify target houses, monitor delivery patterns, steal packages during optimal times, and then resell the contents through multiple online accounts. This was organized criminal activity that violated numerous federal laws. The formal charges against Nancy included mail theft, wire fraud, breaking and entering, and organized retail crime with a potential sentence of 3 to 5 years in federal prison. The revelation that Nancy had been using her HOA authority to facilitate criminal activity hit the neighborhood like a bomb. Residents who had been intimidated by her rules and regulations suddenly understood that her obsession with control had been covering for something much more sinister. The woman who had positioned herself as the guardian of community standards had actually been the biggest threat to community safety, using her access to everyone's personal information and delivery patterns to systematically rob her own neighbors. Several residents admitted that they'd suspected something was wrong with Nancy's behavior, but had been too intimidated by her authority to speak up or investigate their suspicions. 3 months after Nancy's arrest, Maple Grove had transformed into the kind of neighborhood I'd originally hoped to find when I moved there. The residents voted me in as the new HOA president, and our first official act was to revise the community guidelines to focus on actual safety and neighborly support rather than arbitrary aesthetic rules and surveillance of residents' activities. Nancy Carter pled guilty to all federal charges in exchange for a reduced sentence of 30 months in prison plus $78,000 in restitution to her victims. The Neighborhood Watch program we established actually brought residents together instead of turning them against each other, and children were once again allowed to play in their front yards without fear of being reported for imaginary violations. Nancy Carter thought she was playing chess with a quiet artist who would never fight back against her campaign of harassment and theft. Turns out she was playing checkers with federal investigators who had been building a case against her for months. Sometimes justice comes late, but when it arrives, it brings handcuffs and a perp walk in front of your entire neighborhood. Welcome to the new Maple Grove, where packages are protected, criminals are prosecuted, and community standards actually mean treating people with respect and kindness. And if you're an HOA Karen reading this and thinking about using your position to steal from your neighbors, remember that those packages you're eyeing might contain more than just art supplies. They might contain federal tracking devices and a one-way ticket to prison, courtesy of neighbors who refuse to be victims anymore.
Thanks for watching QA Stories. Share this video with someone who loves a good plot twist. And don't forget to subscribe.